The whole of Cade County was white with apple bloom the last warm week of April that year, orchard after orchard from the river road, clear up to the foot of the hills, standing in a pink and white cloud of it. 10,000 trees of the big showy Ambrose red all come into flower in the same 3 days, and folks drove out from town on a Sunday just to look at it and say there had never been a bloom. Like it in living memory, when Dosia Merrill's old orchard up on Winnow Ridge stood dark and bare against the sky with hardly a petal showing, her trees still holding their flowers shut in hard little pink buds the way they did every single spring. 2 full weeks behind the whole valley, and Harlan Voss stood in the wide door of the grower's packing shed with 3 other men and watched her drive. Her rusted truck down the ridge road past all that blooming money, and he said it loud enough to carry, kindly, the way Harlan said everything, that there went the last woman in the county still nursing her grandmother's runt apples, that Dosia Merrill would be up on that ridge come October picking little brown russets no bigger than a walnut while the rest of them shipped Ambrose red by the boxcar. And would somebody kindly explain to her that the market paid $1 for a big red apple and would not give a plugged nickel for a bushel of ugly ridge fruit that bloomed so late every year it was a wonder the bees ever found it? The men laughed, not cruelly, because none of them were cruel men, and Dosia lifted 2 fingers off the wheel at them the way you wave at people you have known your whole life, and drove on home to Half Moon Road, and that April afternoon the valley only laughed. 12 days later, on the far side of the coldest May night that country had felt in 50 years, those same men would come up Winnow Ridge, 1 truck at a time, to stand in Dosia Merrill's dooryard with their hats in their hands and ask her for wood off her ugly little trees, and Harlan Voss would sit in his truck at the bottom of her lane for the better part of an hour before he could make himself drive up. Now you have to understand what an apple blossom is and what a late frost does to it, because the whole of this story sits on that one thing, and most folks in town had forgotten it the way you forget a thing that has not bit you in a while. An apple does not come from the tree. It comes from the flower. And every apple you have ever eaten began as one open blossom on a spring morning that had to live long enough to be pollinated and set into fruit. And an open apple blossom is about the most tender living thing there is. Let the temperature fall much below 28 degrees for even a couple of hours, while a tree is in full open bloom, the way the whole valley was that year, and the frost goes right into the open flower and turns the little green center of it black, and a killed blossom sets no fruit. Not that day. Not that year. Not ever. Because a tree blooms 1 time each spring and does not bloom again. That is the whole danger a fruit grower lives under every April of his life, that a warm early spring will coax his trees into full open flower, and then a hard cold night will come along behind it and kill the entire crop in the dark in a single night while he sleeps. And there is not one thing on this earth he can do about it once the blossoms are open, and every grower in Cade County knew this the way you know a thing in a book, and had simply been lucky year upon year, and had come to plant their whole living on that luck without ever once calling it by its name. Because here is the thing about the 2 kinds of apple tree in that county. The Ambrose red that the whole valley had gone over to was an early blooming tree. And it was an early blooming tree on purpose, bred that way. Because a tree that flowers early ripens its fruit early, and the first big red apples down to the market in the fall fetched near double what the late fruit brought. And so for 30 years every grower in Cade County had chased the early bloom and the early market and the big red early dollar, and had grafted his whole orchard over to a tree that came into flower the 3rd week of April, whether it was safe to or not. A tree standing there in full tender bloom a full 2 weeks before the last frost of spring was ever truly past. And Dosia Merrill's trees were the old ridge russet her grandmother had bred, and the one thing everybody knew about the ridge russet, the thing they laughed at, was that it bloomed late. It was a shy, late-blooming tree that held its flowers shut tight in the bud until the cold nights of spring were good and done and gone, and it gave up the early market to do it. And it made a small, plain, brownish apple that no city buyer ever fell in love with, and it had exactly one virtue in all the world, which was that a tree still holding its bloom shut in a hard, tight bud cannot have that bloom killed by a frost, because there is nothing open yet for the frost to get into. Docia Murrell had been born on Winnow Ridge and raised by a grandmother who kept that orchard, a woman named Iva Murrell, who had walked those same rows with a little girl at her skirts and taught her, and Docia had spent the first 18 years of her life following an old woman up and down between the russet trees every spring and every fall, learning why her grandmother grafted the wood she grafted and cut away the wood she cut. And above everything else, learning the one law of that ridge, which Iva Murrell said to the child so many times it wore a groove in her, that up on the ridge the frost is the landlord, and every spring it comes to see is the rent paid, and the only tree that ever pays its rent is the one that keeps its bloom in its pocket until the landlord has gone back down the hill. Docia had married a quiet man named Emery, who worked the ridge orchard beside her for 40 years. Small, careful crops of small, careful apples sold at the door and at the county market, and pressed into a cider that people drove a long way for. And Emery had died 2 winters back, and Docia had buried him up at the top of the ridge, where you could see the whole home orchard laid out below. And she had gone on keeping the trees alone, an old woman on a ridge with a grafting knife and a ball of twine and 80 years of her grandmother's law in her head, the last of the ridge russets in a county gone all the way over to the big red apple. There was a man on the next ridge, Corliss Pruitt, who had kept a block of the old late apples too, and Corliss had passed that same winter. And when they sold his place to settle at the trees, went to a man who bulldozed the whole late block out in one afternoon and burned it in a pile and put in Ambrose Red on the cleared ground. And folks said it was about time. That Corliss had been the only man besides the Merrill widow still growing apples nobody wanted. And Docia had driven the long way around for a month so she would not have to see the black scar where those old trees had stood. She thought about asking for a little grafting wood off them before the doozer came, and by the time she made up her mind the trees were already burned, and she told herself that her own block was enough, and that a person cannot save every old thing. And she planted a dozen young russets that spring in the low corner to make up the difference, grafted by her own hand off her own trees. Harlan Voss heard she had put in more of the late trees instead of grubbing hers out like a sensible person, and he set it down at the packing shed, not unkindly, that the old woman had finally gone all the way backward, that here was the whole county straining every year to bloom earlier and pick earlier and beat the market, and Docia Murrell up there planting more trees bred a purpose to bloom last of anybody and sell cheapest of anybody. And that sentiment was a fine thing, but it did not pay the note at the bank. His boy said the thing that stuck, the way the young ones do. Kobe Voss held up his thumb and one finger an inch apart to show the size of a ridge russet, and walked down the loading dock stooped over squinting at his little pinched fingers like a man hunting a lost button. And after that, the valley did not call it the Merrill Orchard anymore. It called it the Walnut Ranch. And men would slow their trucks on the ridge road in bloom time just to look at the bare, dark trees standing there stubborn among all that valley, white and grin. But here is what Docia Murrell was actually doing up on that ridge, ear by ear and tree by tree, and it is the thing not one soul down in the valley could see. She was not just letting the trees bloom late by accident. She was choosing it every year, on purpose. Every spring she walked the orchard in bloom time with a piece of soft red chalk, and where a young seedling tree or a chance limb had bloomed even a few days earlier than its neighbors, she marked it to be cut out or grafted over. Because an early bloomer on the ridge was a tree that would get its crop killed sooner or later, and she would not breed off it or keep it. And where a tree held its flower latest and tightest of all, opening its bloom only after every danger was past, and still setting a good crop of sound, plain fruit, she marked that one to save wood from, and cut her grafts off it, and made her new trees out of it. That was the first thing the valley could not see, that the late bloom they laughed at was not the ridge russet being backward. It was 80 years of one family choosing, spring after spring, to keep only the trees that waited, the same way a shepherd keeps only his soundest ewes, until the whole orchard had been bred true to one plain stubborn habit, which was to keep its bloom shut in the bud until the frost was gone. She thinned her fruit hard by hand. That was the second thing, and the thing that looked to the valley like a woman too old or too soft to farm for money, that where the Ambrose men loaded every limb with all the fruit it would carry to make the boxes and the dollars, Dosea went through her trees in June on a 3-legged ladder and pulled off 2 apples out of every 3 while they were still no bigger than a marble. And let only the best-placed few grow on, so her trees carried a light crop of clean, well-fed fruit on strong wood instead of a heavy crop of small, poor fruit on limbs bent to breaking. And she gave up bushels to do it, gave them up on purpose every year, and never once complained of the lighter load, because she was not growing the most apples. She was growing a tree that stayed sound and healthy and alive to bloom again the next spring and the spring after that out past her own life, the way her grandmother's trees had lived past hers. She kept her own grafting wood. That was the third thing, and the thing that made no sense at all to a valley that ordered its young trees by the 100 out of a nursery catalog. That Dosea Mirel every late winter walked her orchard with a sharp knife on the coldest still days and cut her scionwood, the young straight 1-year shoots she would graft come spring, only off the trees that had proved themselves, the latest bloomers, the soundest croppers, the ones that had come through a hard spring with their fruit set when a warm one might have fooled a lesser tree into. Blooming early, and she wrapped that wood in damp cloth and kept it cold in the cellar, and every new tree she ever set on that ridge was grafted by her own hand off her own proven trees, and cost her nothing but the cutting and the tying, and carried forward the one habit she had spent her life selecting for, while the whole valley bought its trees new from a catalog every few years. Trees bred for the early market and the big red dollar by men 1,000 miles away who had never once stood on Winnow Ridge in a killing frost. She did not do it alone that year. There was a young man named Pruitt Gaines, 24 years old, who ran the grading belt down at the grower's packing shed for wages and had sorted a great many thousand apples across that belt. And he had known Dosea since he was a boy. Since a winter she had brought a crate of her cider up to his mother's house the year his father was laid off and never said a word about it after. Pruitt came up to Winnow Ridge on a Saturday in bloom time to see the late orchard for himself because he was curious, and he came back the next Saturday and the one after that, and Dosea paid him in cash and dinner and a jug of cider and the answer to every question he asked, and he asked good ones. She showed him the red chalk and the rule, and he learned it faster than she expected, and by the 3rd Saturday he was walking ahead of her, marking the early limbs before she got to them and marking them right. He had graded 100,000 Ambrose red across that belt and never once thought about where the trees came from, that they were bred 1,000 miles away to bloom early and sell early and were set out in full flower every April 2 weeks before the frost was safe. And Dosea stood in the blooming ridge orchard and told him the plain thing her grandmother told her, that there are 2 ways to grow an apple. You can chase the early dollar and pray the frost stays home, or you can keep a tree that waits, and only one of those can a cold May night take clean away from you in the dark while you sleep. Pruitt heard the men call it the Walnut Ranch every week down at the shed, and never once carried a word of it back up the hill, which at 24 is a good deal harder than it sounds. The county's man came out in the last week of April, a fruit specialist named Wexler Boyd, who drove all of Cade County looking at orchards and knew more about an apple tree than any man alive in that country, and he walked Dosea Mirel's ridge orchard for the better part of an hour and did not say much while he did it. What he found he told her straight at the tailgate. The trees were sound. The wood was strong and well pruned. The roots were deep. The fruit she set ran clean and healthy year on year. And in a county where he spent every spring looking at Ambrose red, pushed hard, and cropped heavy and blooming earlier every season as the growers chased the market. This old ridge orchard was the soundest block of apple trees he had put his hands on all year. And then he told her the honest hard thing too, because he liked her, which was that sound did not mean rich. that a late plain russet would never fetch what an early red apple fetched at the city market, that her neighbor's early fruit out earned hers 2-to-1 in any ordinary year, and that the smart money in Cade County, whatever the trees looked like up close, was still the early red apple in the valley. Dosea asked him one question. She asked him whether, in all the years he had driven that county, he had ever once seen the early orchards truly tested by a hard late frost, a real killing cold, coming in behind a warm spring, with every valley tree in full open bloom. And Wexler Boyd stood there a second and said that no, they had been lucky, that the county had not caught a killing May frost in a bad bloom year since before he took the job, and that he did not much like to think about what a night like that would do to 10,000 trees standing open. Dosea said that was the only frost her orchard was bred to live through, and that she would trade him half her crop every year of her life to own the one orchard in the county still holding its bloom safe on the morning after a night like that, and Wexler Boyd wrote something in his own book and did not argue with her. Word of the market numbers got around, the way such things do, and everybody knew the Merrill fruit sold cheap and sold late and never near what the early red apple brought, and Harlan Voss said down at the shed that it only proved what he had said all along, that a body could be sentimental or a body could be solvent, and that Dosea was paying dear for the difference, and the men nodded, because it was kind and it was final and it settled the matter, and Kobe did the stooped walk down the loading dock, hunting his lost button, and got his laugh. And up on Winnow Ridge, Dosha Merrill cut her cyanwood off the trees that waited and wrapped it in damp cloth and laid it cold in the cellar and slept fine. Now understand what kind of a spring came on that year, because the weather laid the whole trap itself, and every man in the valley walked into it grinning. It came on warm early, and it stayed warm, a soft, coaxing fall spring warmth all through the back half of March and into April, the ground warming fast and the sap running early, and it pulled the early trees of Cade County into bloom near 2 weeks ahead of any normal year. By the 3rd week of April, the whole valley stood in the fullest, earliest, heaviest bloom anybody could remember, 10,000 Ambrose red in full open flower under a warm blue sky, and every grower who drove past that white valley rubbed his hands, because an early full bloom like that in a warm year meant an early heavy crop and the top of the market. The best apple year the county had seen in a generation, and every man of them drove past Dosea Merrill's dark bare ridge, where the russet still held shut in the tight bud, and shook his head at the poor old woman 2 weeks behind the whole world and certain to be last to market yet again. Harlan Voss stood in his own valley orchard the 4th week of April with his boy beside him and looked out over more open blossom than he had ever owned in his life, and said it was the year that finally proved it, that the early tree was the rich tree, that old Dosea had thrown away half her crop for 40 years, being scared of a frost that never came any more. The frost came on the night of the 4th of May. It had been a fair warm day, and then in the evening the wind swung around clean into the north, and the sky went hard and clear and starry, which any old orchard hand will tell you is the very worst thing a clear, still, cold night after a warm spell, and the cold came down out of that clear sky and pooled in the valley like water finding the low ground, and along about 2 in the morning the thermometer at the packing shed read 24 degrees, and it sat there or below it for the better part of 5 hours. 24 degrees on 10,000 apple trees standing in full open bloom. And there was not one thing a single grower in that valley could do but stand in his own orchard in the dark in his coat and watch it happen. Understand what that night did, because the frost is not the story, the frost is only the bill coming due. A tree in full open bloom has its whole crop hanging out in the cold in 10,000 tender open flowers, and when the cold goes into an open blossom, it kills the little green ovary at the heart of it stone dead, and a killed blossom is a killed apple. And on the night of the 4th of May, the cold went into every open flower in the valley of Cade County and killed it, all of it, in the dark, in a single night, while the growers stood by helpless and watched their breath smoke. By the next morning the damage did not even show yet. That was the cruel part of it. The valley still stood white and pretty in the dawn. The killed blossoms still hanging on the trees, looking near as fair as they had the day before. And it was not until you pulled a flower open and looked at the center of it and saw it gone brown and black instead of green that you knew the whole crop of Cade County had died in the night and was only waiting a few days to fall. And fall it did. Within the week the valley bloom that had been the pride of the county browned and withered and dropped. 10,000 trees shedding their killed flowers onto the ground in a brown rain, and where there should have been 100,000 bushels of early red apples coming on there was going to be, on the whole floor of that valley, next to nothing. A scattered handful of late-side blossoms that had somehow been shut when the cold came, and no more. A total loss, a whole county's apple year killed in 5 hours in the dark. And it was nobody's fault, and it was everybody's. And there was not one particle of meanness left in Cade County that week. Only the cold and the clear sky and 40 years of chasing the early market all coming due in one night. The word ruined started getting used at the shed in a flat voice by men who had never once used it about their own trees. And up on Winnow Ridge, the ridge russet did not know a thing had happened. Dosia Morell's late trees had been standing that whole warm April with their bloom shut tight in the hard pink bud, waiting on the cold to be gone the way they had been bred to wait for 80 years. And when the frost came down on the night of the 4th of May, there was nothing on those trees for the cold to kill. Not one open flower. The whole crop safe, shut away in the bud. And 3 days later, in the first warm sun after the freeze, while every tree in the valley below was dropping its dead bloom in a brown rain, the whole ridge orchard on Winnow Ridge came into flower at last, right on its own late schedule. 2 weeks behind the valley, and 1 night past the killing frost, the trees breaking open into a clean pink and white bloom in the safe warm air with every blossom sound, and every bee in the county suddenly come up the hill to the only flowers left alive, and it set all of it, the fullest crop that ridge had carried in years. Kobe Voss saw it first, and he saw it from the road. His father had sent the boy up the county line in the first light of the morning to see how far down the valley the frost had reached, and he stopped his truck on the ridge road below their Merrill orchard and sat there a long time with the engine running, because from that rise you could see both things at one time. Below him, spread across the whole floor of the valley, his own family's orchards and every orchard else stood browning and dropping their killed bloom. A whole year and the best-looking crop in a generation going brown on the branch. Above him, on the other side of one fence, Dosia Morell's old ridge russets stood just coming into their full, clean, late bloom in the morning sun. Pink and white and humming with bees, every flower on them alive, the Walnut Ranch. The joke the whole valley had grinned at for 30 years, blooming safe and full and sound on the morning after the coldest night in 50 years, as if the frost had been a thing that happened in another country. Same night, same county, same warm, treacherous spring. He did not say anything to anybody about it for a good while. Wexler Boyd said his first, because he was the one driving the whole county that week looking at brown orchards with nothing in his book that could bring a killed blossom back. And he stopped at Winnow Ridge on a Thursday and leaned on Dosia Morell's tailgate and said it plain. He said he had told her a week ago that the smart money was the early red apple, and that he had been wrong, and that the late-blooming trees she and her grandmother had been choosing and grafting for 80 years, the trees that waited, were the whole reason her orchard was the only bloom left alive in Cade County, and he wanted that written down in his own book, in his own hand. Harlan Voss took until the last Sunday in May. He was a good man, and he had been wrong for years running, and both of those things stayed true the whole way through, and it cost him more to drive up that ridge than it cost any of the others. He had lost his whole crop. He had a note at the bank against a year that was never going to come now, and he did not yet know how he would carry the place to the next fall. And he sat in his truck at the bottom of Dosia Morell's lane for the better part of an hour before he could make himself drive up, and Dosia saw him down there and let him sit. Because she had watched Harlan Voss coming for 30 years, and she was not going to make it easy nor hard, only quiet. He stood in her dooryard with his hat in his hands, and said he had come to ask a thing, and would take it kindly if she did not enjoy it too much, and Dosia told him she was too old to enjoy anything that had taken 30 years and cost the county its crop to arrive. What Harlan wanted was wood. He wanted grafting wood off her late trees, scion wood off the ridge russet, to work into his own orchard and breathe the late bloom and the waiting into a place that a single cold night had just finished, teaching him it could kill down to the bank in 5 hours whenever it took a mind to, and he stood there in the dooryard and said the thing that cost him the most, that he had been the man in the county whose whole business it was to know better, that he had stood in that packing shed door for 30 years and helped the whole valley laugh at the last woman still keeping the trees that waited, and had not understood one single thing he was looking at. Dosia gave him wood. She cut him good sound scion wood off her latest soundest trees and would not take $1 for it, and she would not take his money either for the other thing he needed, which was to be shown how it was done, and she spent an afternoon in his Browning Valley orchard telling him what to change, graft the late wood in over the years, and let the orchard learn to wait. Quit chasing a bloom 2 weeks early for a market that a single frost could take back in one night. Cut your own wood off the trees that come through a hard spring with their crop set so the frost does your choosing for you. And stop buying the early dollar every spring at the price of your whole crop riding open and tender under a clear, cold sky. Harlan did most of it over the years that came after, and his orchard came back slower than he wanted and surer than he had any right to. Later, blooming wood in it now, a plain brown russet limb grafted into every red tree like a hedge against the dark, and a killing frost never cleaned him out to the bank like that again. Pruitt Gaines quit the grading belt that summer. He took a bundle of Dosia Myrrell scion wood on a handshake and the promise of his labor, and he grafted it onto a block of run-out old trees on his mother's few acres that nobody had picked in years, and Dosia drove down in the spring to see it standing, the young late grafts taking hold and holding their bloom shut safe while the valley flowered early all around them, and the old woman had to go look at something in the truck for a minute. That fall, Dosia Myrrell brought in about the only full clean apple crop in Cade County, plain brown russets off the ridge, the Walnut Ranch fruit, and when she hauled the first load down to the grower's shed, the grading floor went quiet the way a room goes quiet, and Pruitt Gaines ran them across the belt and packed them out. And it was a full sound crop off the one orchard that a killing frost had walked straight over, off a ridge that had given up half its bushels and the whole early market every year for 80 years to buy the one thing no early dollar could buy, which is a tree still holding a live crop on the morning after the cold. Odell Kane, who managed the packing shed and had bought and graded apples in that county for 30 years, and had spent that whole miserable May turning away growers with nothing to sell and no crop to grade, stood at the rail while the ridge russets ran onto the empty belt, and said, to nobody in particular, that he had told half the men in that county for years that the smart tree was the early tree, and that he had been wrong every year he said it, and that he wanted it known he had been wrong. He did not have to say it. But he was the kind of man who said a thing like that out loud when it was true, and it went around the county in his voice, which carried further than Dosia Myrrell's ever would, because Dosia was not going to say one word of it herself. Dosia cut and gave and sold scion wood off her ridge russets over the next several springs to better than 60 orchards across 4 counties, clear down into the low-frost pocket country to the south, where a late-blooming tree was worth more than an early one twice over, and every bundle of wood that went out her lane went with a page she had typed herself on an old machine and run off at the library, and the page said what to do and, more to the point, what not to do. Graft the late wood in and let the orchard learn to wait. Walk your trees in bloom time and cut out the early bloomers. Keep wood only off the trees that flower last and still set a sound crop. Thin your fruit hard by hand and carry a light, clean crop on strong wood, not a heavy, poor one on breaking limbs. Keep your own grafting wood off your own proven trees so no catalog and no cold night can take your orchard clean away from you. And at the bottom of the page, The one line that was not an instruction was the thing her grandmother used to say up on the ridge with a bud in her fingers, that up on the ridge the frost is the landlord, and every spring it comes to see is the rent paid. And the only tree that pays is the one that keeps its bloom in its pocket until the landlord is gone back down the hill. The old ridge russets never left Winnow Ridge. That was the part the county came to like best, that Dosia Murrell never grafted one limb of the early red apple onto her ground, not one, not ever, that the same russet her grandmother bred grew on the home orchard every spring of her life, plain and brown and small, holding its bloom shut in the bud 2 weeks past the valley and breaking open safe every year after the frost had gone. They never once out-earned the early red apple in a fair year, and never would, and every April the trucks still slowed on the ridge road to look at the bare dark trees standing stubborn in all that valley white. But they did not grin anymore, because half the frost-safe apple wood in 4 counties traced back now to an orchard a whole valley had called the Walnut Ranch. And there were late-blooming trees on 60 places that had come off Dosia Murrell's grafting knife, and every one of them held its bloom safe in the bud until the cold was gone. She heard, before she got too old to hear much, that her grandmother's 80 years of choosing had not died on that ridge with her, but was grafted now into orchards on both sides of 4 counties, and had come through the worst frost in 50 years with its crop alive, and that was as much of that as she ever needed to know. If you have stayed with her this far, you already know this was never about apples. Dosia Murrell is the reason there is late-blooming wood in near every orchard on that end of the county now. And she never made a speech about it, and she never once said "I told you so" to a soul who had laughed at her, and to the day she quit walking the rows, she would tell you flat that she had not been clever. She had only been raised by a woman who kept the trees that waited and taught her that a crop hung out early and open under a spring sky is not money in the bank, it is money on a bet, and that the frost is the one lender that always, sooner or later, comes up the hill to collect. She was laughed at for 30 years by good men who were not cruel, only certain, and she was proven right in 5 hours by a cold, clear night that did not care about one of them, and in between she did nothing but walk her rows, mark her early limbs, thin her fruit, cut her wood off the trees that waited, and drive her rusted truck down past all that early valley bloom every spring while people who liked her grinned. That is all competence ever is. It is the small right thing done the plain old careful way on the day it is due for 80 years while the whole valley blooms early and prays the frost stays home. So tell me which one you would have been that April on the Ridge Road. There were only 2 kinds of grower in that valley, and neither kind was a bad person. The ones who looked at a bare dark orchard 2 weeks behind the world and saw a stubborn old woman throwing money away, and the one who looked at those same shutbuds and saw the only apples in the county that would still be alive on a morning nobody had come to yet. Be honest about it. Most of us are the first kind, and the first kind is not stupid. It is only certain, and certain is the most expensive thing a person can be. Write down in the comments which one you were, and tell me what part of the country you are reading this from tonight, because I read every one of them, and I like knowing where you all are sitting. Next time, I want to tell you about the man on the far side of that same county who left a wide strip of his best cropland grown up in scrubby old trees everybody swore was a waste of good ground, and what his neighbors came to ask him the year the dust finally started to blow. And if this one got to you, send it on to somebody who has been told that the old careful way they do a thing, the slow way, the way that gives up a little every year to be sure, is a foolish waste of good money. Up on the ridge on Winnow Ridge, an hour before dark, a gray-headed woman in a worn barn coat walks out between 2 rows of bare dark trees with a piece of red chalk in her pocket she does not really need yet. And she stops at a plain old russet standing shut and stubborn while the whole valley below has already bloomed, and she marks it to save wood from 1 more year.